The war on the alien planet was fierce. Explosions rang out in the distance, and the sound of weapons clashing echoed across the jagged landscape. Elias, a seasoned human warrior, stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching as his comrades fought to secure the area. The sky above was dark with smoke, the air thick with the smell of burnt metal and charred earth. His unit had been tasked with taking the enemy's stronghold, but things had quickly spiraled into chaos. "Keep moving," his commanding officer shouted over the comms, urging the soldiers forward. Elias nodded, clutching his weapon tighter. As he jogged toward the rest of his team, his heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was focused. He had seen battle many times before, but this was different. The enemy was fierce, and their numbers seemed endless. As Elias sprinted through the dense smoke, he spotted a figure in the distance. At first, he thought it was another soldier, one of his own, lying injured on the ground. But as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. This was not a human. This was an alien. She lay motionless on the rocky ground, her body twisted in a way that indicated something serious had happened. Her dark green skin was stained with dirt and blood, and her eyes, though half closed, were filled with fear and confusion. She had clearly been in the thick of the battle, but there was no one around to help her. Elias paused, taking in the sight of her. She was unlike any alien he had seen before. Her appearance was striking, delicate yet strong. Her long, dark hair was tangled in the dirt, and her armor, a form-fitting suit of advanced alien technology, was torn and battered from the violence of the battle. The alien woman's legs were bent at an unnatural angle, and Elias could tell she had been paralyzed, unable to move or defend herself. The other soldiers, both human and alien, were too busy with their own battles to notice her plight. Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen death in battle, but this was different. He knew he couldn't just leave her behind. He glanced around, searching for a way to get to her without drawing attention from the enemy. The sounds of fighting were growing louder, and time was running out. Elias took a deep breath and made his decision. He couldn't leave her. With quick, purposeful strides, Elias approached the alien woman. He crouched beside her, his heart racing. Her eyes, though dim with pain, locked onto his. She blinked a few times, clearly surprised that someone had stopped to help. Elias tried to speak, but the noise of the battle made it nearly impossible to hear himself. Instead, he placed a hand gently on her shoulder, trying to reassure her. "Don't worry," he muttered. "I won't leave you." The alien woman's breath hitched as if she didn't quite understand his words, but the gentleness in his touch seemed to calm her. Elias carefully placed his arm beneath her back and another under her legs, lifting her as gently as possible. Her body was light, though her armor added some weight. He could feel her muscles tense at first, unsure of what was happening, but she didn't resist. As he stood up, Elias glanced around, his eyes scanning for any signs of the enemy. The last thing he needed was to get caught in the middle of the crossfire with an injured alien woman in his arms. He could feel her breathing shallowly against his chest, but she didn't make a sound. "Hold on," Elias whispered, his voice soft but steady. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but it was more for his own comfort. The soldier was used to being alone on the battlefield, but this felt different. He wasn't sure what was driving him to protect her, but there was something about her vulnerability, her strength, that stirred something deep within him. With slow, deliberate steps, Elias carried her through the battlefield. He moved carefully, avoiding the worst of the fighting. The air was filled with explosions and the clatter of weapons, but Elias focused only on the alien woman in his arms. She felt fragile, and he could sense the fear in her. But despite everything, she held herself with dignity. Elias could see it in her eyes. Even though she was injured, she was still a warrior. She had fought bravely, but now she was helpless. Soldiers around him seemed to take no notice of the pair as they rushed past. Some shot confused glances at Elias, but no one said anything. It wasn't common for humans to stop and help aliens, especially in the heat of battle. It was the kind of decision that could cost a soldier his life. But Elias wasn't thinking about that now. All he could think of was getting her to safety. He finally reached a small cluster of rocks, a temporary shelter where a few soldiers had regrouped. Elias carefully placed the alien woman on the ground, making sure she was comfortable. She looked up at him, her eyes still filled with both confusion and gratitude. Her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. "Are you all right?" Elias asked, his voice low. The alien woman's lips parted, but no words came out. Her chest seemed to tighten as if she was struggling to speak. Elias knelt beside her, not sure what to do. He didn't speak her language, and she probably didn't speak his. But in that moment, they didn't need words. They had something stronger trust. The others in the group had begun to notice what was happening, but no one intervened. There was something about the way Elias treated her that commanded respect. The human warrior's actions were rare in this war, a display of compassion amidst a sea of violence. "You're safe now," Elias murmured, more to himself than to her. He knew it wasn't true. The war was far from over, and danger was still all around them. But in that moment, it was enough to offer her a brief respite from the chaos. Elias stayed by her side, watching over her as the sounds of battle raged on in the distance. He wasn't sure what had drawn him to this alien woman, but he knew one thing: he couldn't just walk away. And as the minutes ticked by, Elias made a silent promise. He would protect her, whatever it took. Elias sat quietly beside the alien woman, his mind racing as he tried to understand the gravity of the situation. He had never imagined he would find himself in this position helping an injured alien when his mission was far from over. He glanced at her again. Her eyes were now closed, and the faint rise and fall of her chest showed that she was still breathing, but it was shallow. She seemed to be resting, but Elias knew that the battle wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before the fighting would come back for them. "Stay with me," Elias whispered softly, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "You're not alone." His voice was low, more to comfort himself than to offer her any kind of reassurance. The words felt strange coming from him. He had always been the one to fight alone, to rely on no one but himself. He had seen many soldiers, both human and alien, left to die on the battlefield. He had seen the cold indifference of war, where kindness was a luxury and survival was the only thing that mattered. Yet, here he was, cradling a wounded enemy who had no reason to trust him. Elias looked around, scanning the horizon. The battle was still raging in the distance, but they were far enough from the front lines to be safe, at least for the moment. His heart pounded as he thought about what to do next. The mission was clear: secure the area, gather intel, and wait for orders. But there was no way he could simply leave her here. A part of him knew it was risky. The other soldiers wouldn't understand. The higher-ups might not even approve of his actions. In this war, every second counted. Every move could mean life or death. But Elias couldn't bring himself to follow the cold, calculated logic of war that treated soldiers like pawns. He had spent too many years fighting for a cause that didn't care about people. Now, standing here with this alien woman, he realized he couldn't ignore the humanity that still existed within him. The alien woman stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. She was awake, but her expression was one of confusion. She blinked, then focused on Elias. He was surprised to see the clear gaze in her eyes, despite her obvious pain. "Don't try to speak," Elias said, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now." The alien woman's lips parted, and she managed to whisper something, though the words were barely audible. Who are you?" Elias hesitated, not sure how to respond. He had never been one to reveal much about himself, especially to someone who was technically his enemy. But something about the question, the vulnerability in her voice, made him lower his guard. "My name is Elias," he said simply. He paused for a moment, unsure of what else to say. "I'm a soldier. I couldn't leave you behind." She studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to make sense of his words. He couldn't read her expression, not entirely. But the way she looked at him, intense, yet filled with something else, made him feel as though she was weighing his every move. Why? She asked. Elias wasn't sure how to answer that. Why had he chosen to help her? He wasn't sure himself. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment, his voice soft but steady. "I just ... couldn't leave you to die." The alien woman nodded slowly, as though she understood. She tried to sit up, but a sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips, and she collapsed back against the ground. Elias immediately moved closer, placing a hand under her head to support her. She winced but didn't protest. "Don't try to move," he said. "You're hurt badly." "I'm fine," she replied weakly, but her words held no conviction. It was clear that she knew she was far from fine. Elias couldn't help but admire her resilience. She was clearly a warrior, just like him. Her species, though different from his own, had a sense of honor that he could recognize. She was proud, even in her broken state. "You're not fine," Elias said gently, "but I'm going to help you. You just need to rest for now." The alien woman looked at him again, studying him carefully, and for a brief moment their gazes locked. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. Elias felt the weight of that look, and for a moment he was unsure what to do next. He had been trained to be cold, to act without hesitation. But with her, he felt a tug at something inside him, something he hadn't expected to feel on this war-torn planet. "I'm Solara," she said, suddenly breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, but there was strength behind it. I am from the Arvanth tribe. I'm a warrior." Elias nodded, understanding. He had heard of the Arvanth before, one of the most powerful and respected species in the galaxy, known for their fearlessness and strength. Solara's people were fierce fighters, and her strength was evident, even now. "You're a warrior," Elias said, almost to himself. "I can see it." Solara gave him a weak smile, though it quickly faded into a pained expression. She closed her eyes again, clearly exhausted. Elias remained by her side, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sounds of battle grew quieter as the enemy forces moved farther away, but Elias knew that their respite wouldn't last long. He had to make a decision: soon stay here and risk getting caught, or take Solara and try to find a safer location. Had to protect her. Elias made up his mind. "I'm going to carry you," he said firmly. "We're going to get to safety." Solara opened her eyes, her gaze sharp despite her exhaustion. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Double quotes, thank you," she whispered. Elias didn't reply immediately. Instead, he carefully positioned himself to lift her. His arms slipped beneath her back and legs, and with a gentle movement, he stood up, holding her carefully in his arms. She winced in pain, but didn't make a sound. Her body was light in his arms, though he could feel the weight of her armor pressing against him. The moment felt surreal. Here he was, carrying an enemy warrior through a war zone with nothing but his instincts guiding him. It was the kind of thing that no one in the military would ever do, but Elias didn't care. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a human being. And right now, all that mattered was getting Solara to safety. As Elias moved away from the battlefield, he couldn't help but glance down at the alien woman in his arms. She was still unconscious, her face pale, but there was something different in her expression now, something softer. "You'll be all right," Elias whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." And with that promise, he carried her away from the battlefield, hoping against hope that he hadn't made a mistake. Elias walked carefully through the rocky terrain, Solara still in his arms. He had moved further away from the chaos of the battle, but his heart still raced with urgency. Every step he took was deliberate, cautious, and filled with the weight of the decision he had made. The ground beneath his boots felt uneven, but he kept his focus, knowing that getting to safety was their only chance. Solara's body felt light in his arms, but the subtle rise and fall of her chest reminded him of the fragility of the moment. Despite her strong and proud demeanor, she was helpless now, paralyzed and unable to move on her own. Elias was her only hope. It was a strange feeling to be the one someone relied on, but somehow it felt right. The cool air of the alien planet brushed against his face, but Elias barely noticed it. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of the battle they had just escaped. He had witnessed death countless times, but this felt different. Carrying Solara, seeing the fear in her eyes, stirred something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Elias wasn't sure how long they walked, but it felt like an eternity. As he moved forward, the rocky landscape began to change. The ground became more uneven, and the distant rumble of ongoing conflict began to fade. After a while, he found an abandoned shelter, a small cave tucked away at the base of a jagged cliff. It looked safe, and it would provide cover for at least a short time. Elias gently lowered Solara to the ground, making sure she was comfortable. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, her gaze filled with confusion. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice weak. "We're safe for now," Elias replied softly. He knelt beside her, trying to make her as comfortable as possible. "You've been through a lot. Just rest." Solara's expression softened, and she nodded slightly. Though she still seemed wary, there was a trust in her eyes now, something Elias hadn't expected. She had allowed him to carry her, to help her when no one else had. But as she lay there, Solara's face grew serious again, as if she were reflecting on something important. Her brows furrowed as she looked up at him. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice still weak but filled with curiosity. "You could have left me. You could have let the others take care of me." Elias was caught off guard by the question. Why had he helped her? He had asked himself the same thing many times in the past few hours. He didn't know her. She was an enemy. She could have killed him just as easily as she could have helped him. "I couldn't leave you behind," Elias said, his voice steady. "I've seen too many people suffer in this war. You didn't deserve to be left for dead." Solara's gaze softened, and for the first time since he had met her, a faint smile touched her lips. She didn't say anything, but Elias could tell that she was trying to process his words. The silence between them was comfortable, and for a brief moment, Elias allowed himself to relax. The sounds of battle were far behind them now, replaced by the soft rustling of the wind and the distant chirping of alien creatures. He took a deep breath and looked down at Solara, who seemed to be resting. "You're strong," Elias said, quietly, almost to himself. "I can see it in your eyes." Solara looked up at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond right away, but Elias could tell she was mulling over his words. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I am a warrior," she said, "but strength doesn't always mean victory. Sometimes it means knowing when to trust someone." Elias nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant. But he understood enough. The war they were fighting was brutal, and trust was in short supply. In the heat of battle, it was easy to forget that the people on the other side were human, just like him. They had families, loved ones, and reasons for fighting. Solara shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position. Her face contorted with pain, but she didn't complain. Elias could see the pride in her eyes, and it only made him more determined to protect her. He knew she didn't want to show weakness, but that didn't matter to him. What mattered was that she was still alive. Rest, Elias said gently. You've done enough. Solara gave a small nod, but her eyes remained open, focused on him. Elias noticed the way she watched him intently, like she was trying to figure him out. It made him uncomfortable, but at the same time, it felt like she was trying to understand the strange bond that had formed between them. For a long while, they sat in silence. Elias watched the distant sky, the setting sun casting an orange glow over the rocky landscape. His thoughts wandered back to the battle, to the soldiers he had left behind. He had made a choice that might cost him everything. But as he glanced down at Solara, lying in his shelter, he knew it had been the right one. Why didn't they help you? Elias asked after a long silence, his voice barely above a whisper. The others, the soldiers, why didn't they stop to help you? Solara's expression hardened, her jaw tightening slightly. She looked away, staring at the ground, and for a moment, Elias thought she wouldn't answer. But then, her voice came softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. They think weakness is a curse, she said. In my world, to be injured is to be useless. No one wants a broken warrior. Elias frowned. He could hear the bitterness in her words, the weight of the rejection she had experienced. She was a warrior, trained for battle, but her injury had left her vulnerable. And in her world, that vulnerability was unforgivable. I'm sorry, Elias said quietly, though he wasn't sure if the words would help. But I don't think you're useless. Solara's gaze shifted back to him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find any hint of deception. There was none. Elias meant every word. She had been a warrior, and even now, she still had a fire inside her that he admired. Thank you, she whispered after a long pause, her voice filled with gratitude. Elias simply nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say, at least not yet. The night began to settle in, the stars emerging in the sky above. Elias kept watch, his senses alert to every sound around them. Though they were safe for the moment, he knew that the war wasn't over. But in the silence of the cave, with Solara resting beside him, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The days after Elias and Solara took shelter in the cave passed slowly. The battle outside had moved on, but the remnants of it were still clear. The distant rumble of explosions and the occasional burst of gunfire reminded them that the war was still ongoing, but for now they were safe. The cave, small and hidden from view, had become their temporary home. Elias didn't know how long they could stay there. The war wasn't going to wait for them to recover. But there was something peaceful about the place. The air was cool, and the silence, broken only by the sounds of Solara's soft breathing and the occasional whisper of wind, felt almost healing. Solara had spent the first few days recovering, though she was still weak. The injury that had paralyzed her legs was serious, but Elias knew it wasn't the worst injury she could have suffered. He had seen enough pain and suffering in his time as a soldier to know that people could survive much worse. But there was something in the way Solara carried herself, her strength, her pride, that made him think she wasn't one to give up easily. Elias would bring her water, and sometimes they'd talk, though the conversation was often quiet and hesitant at first. Solara's trust in him had been slow, but it was growing. And Elias, despite his usual wariness of forming attachments, found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't expected. They didn't talk much about the war. Instead, their conversations were more personal, more about the world they came from, Solara shared stories of her tribe, the Arvanth people. She spoke of their strong warriors, their ancient customs, and the values that had shaped her life. Elias listened intently, fascinated by her words. He had always seen the Arvanth as just another group of enemies, but now, hearing her speak of her people, he saw them as more than that. They were a culture, a history, and they were just as human as his own. Back home, Solara said one evening, her voice faint with exhaustion. We are taught that a warrior's strength is measured by how much pain they can endure. Elias looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. Is that how you see yourself? She nodded, but there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. Yes, strength is everything. It's all we are. Elias shifted slightly, looking away. He didn't know how to respond. He had grown up in a world where strength was also valued, but he had never been told that pain was something to be endured, not conquered. He had seen enough people break under pressure to know that strength came in many forms. It wasn't just about enduring, it was also about knowing when to ask for help. And what if you can't endure? Elias asked, his voice softer than usual. What if the pain is too much? Solara looked at him for a long time before answering, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered his words. Then you fail, she said finally. If you can't endure, you're not fit to lead. Elias sighed, feeling the weight of her words. He had seen failure in many forms, and he knew that sometimes it wasn't a matter of not being strong enough. Sometimes circumstances were just too much to overcome. But that wasn't something he was prepared to say to Solara. Not yet. Where I come from, Elias said, changing the subject slightly. We don't always view strength like that. We believe that there's strength in asking for help, in working together. Solara's eyes softened as she listened to him. You think we should ask for help? Elias nodded. Yes, we all have weaknesses, but we don't have to face them alone. That's what makes us stronger. There was a long pause as Solara thought over his words. Then she nodded, though Elias wasn't sure if she fully understood what he meant. She had grown up in a culture that prized individual strength, and that kind of thinking wasn't easy to change. But he hoped that, little by little, their conversations would open her eyes to a different way of thinking. Over the next few days, Elias continued to care for her, bringing her food and water, helping her move when needed, and keeping watch over the cave. The bond between them continued to grow, though it was still quiet and unspoken. There were moments when they'd catch each other's gaze, and in those brief seconds, it felt like something was forming between them, a connection neither of them had expected. One afternoon, as Elias was cleaning his weapon, Solara spoke up again. I've been thinking, she said, her voice low and hesitant. What will you do when the war is over? Elias paused, looking up at her. It was the first time she had mentioned the future, anything beyond the immediate fight for survival. He set his weapon down, unsure how to answer. I don't know. He admitted, I've never really thought that far ahead. It's always been about surviving, fighting, following orders. Solara studied him for a long moment. Do you want more than that? Elias considered her question carefully. He had never really stopped to think about what he wanted beyond the war. For years, his life had been shaped by the army, by the need to keep moving forward, to fight. He had always believed that after the war, there would be nothing left for him, nothing worth living for. But as he looked at Solara, something stirred inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something else, something that felt bigger than the war itself. He wanted to help her, to protect her. I think I do, Elias said, his voice quieter now. I think I want more. I don't know what it looks like, but I know I want something better than this. Solara's eyes softened, and for the first time, Elias saw a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze. She didn't say anything at first, but her expression spoke volumes. There was something in her eyes, a recognition of his words, that made him feel like they were no longer just soldiers fighting side by side. They were two people, two souls looking for something more, something worth fighting for. As the days passed, the bond between Elias and Solara grew stronger, built on shared moments of quiet conversation, understanding, and ultimately, trust. Elias knew that the war wasn't over and there would be battles ahead. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone in the fight. The days of peace they had found in the cave were quickly slipping away. Elias had known it wouldn't last. The war was still out there, a constant reminder that their safety was temporary. The sounds of battle had grown quieter in the distance, but that didn't mean the enemy had stopped their pursuit. Elias spent his time watching over Solara, helping her recover and keeping his senses alert for any signs of danger. It was only a matter of time before enemy patrols would search the area. The small cave that had provided shelter could easily become a trap. The enemy was relentless, and if they found Solara paralyzed and vulnerable, they would have no mercy. That morning, Elias woke early, his instincts alert. He glanced over at Solara, who was still asleep. Her face was peaceful, but he could tell the rest hadn't been enough to heal her completely. Her injuries were severe, and although she had made progress, her body was still weak. Elias had managed to secure some supplies and clean bandages, but her condition required more than just basic care. He rose quietly, making sure not to wake her. There was something in the air that told him it was time to move, to prepare for whatever might come. The battlefield was always unpredictable, and though they had managed to hide for now, the war would eventually catch up to them. Elias crouched by the entrance of the cave, peering out through the small opening. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint light across the rocky landscape. The silence was almost eerie, but Elias didn't trust it. He had seen how quickly the calm before a storm could change. He checked his weapon, making sure it was ready. Then he turned back to Solara, who was now stirring awake. She blinked several times before looking at him, her expression clouded with confusion and weakness. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice low. "I think we need to move," Elias replied, his voice steady. "The enemy is still out there. We can't stay here forever." Solara didn't argue. She had been through enough battles to understand the dangers of staying too long in one place. Her sharp eyes met his, and despite her condition, there was a quiet determination in her gaze. She might be injured, but she wasn't ready to surrender. "I'm ready," she said softly, though there was still a hint of struggle in her voice. Elias nodded and moved closer to help her sit up. Her body was still stiff, and she winced as she tried to move. Elias gently placed a hand on her shoulder to support her. She didn't say anything but allowed him to assist her. He knew how much it must cost her to show weakness, but he also knew that it wasn't the time for pride. "Take it slow," Elias instructed. "We don't need to rush." They worked together, Elias supporting her as she adjusted to the weight on her legs. They both knew it wouldn't be easy, but there was no other choice. The cave was no longer safe, and Elias couldn't afford to take any chances. After a few moments, Solara managed to sit up fully. She took a deep breath and looked out at the landscape. There were no immediate signs of enemy soldiers, but the silence still felt heavy. Elias was keenly aware that they were being hunted. He had no way of knowing when or where the next attack might come, but he had to be ready. "We'll head toward the cliffs," Elias said after a pause. "It's a longer route, but it's less likely they'll follow us there. We'll need to stay hidden." Solara nodded, though her expression was full of doubt. She wasn't sure how much longer she could endure. The pain was still there, constant and sharp, but she didn't want to admit it. She was a warrior, and warriors didn't show weakness. She had to keep going. "I'll follow your lead," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her tone. With that, they began their journey, moving slowly but steadily. Ilias kept a careful watch on their surroundings, every step taken with purpose. He wasn't just worried about the enemy. They could be anywhere, waiting to strike, but he was also worried about Solara. Though she was strong, she was injured, and every movement seemed to drain her energy. As they moved deeper into the rocky terrain, the sounds of the battle faded away. The farther they got from the fighting, the more isolated they felt. Ilias didn't trust the silence. It was too perfect, too still. He kept his senses sharp, listening for any sign of movement, any indication that they were being followed. Solara stumbled once, her legs giving out beneath her. Ilias immediately reached out to catch her, preventing her from falling. She winced, her face tight with pain, but she didn't speak. She didn't want to show him how much it hurt. "Solara, you need to rest," Ilias said, his voice firm but gentle. "No," she responded quickly, trying to push herself up. "I can keep going." Ilias wasn't sure whether to argue or not. He had seen people push themselves past their limits in battle, and sometimes that led to disastrous results. But he knew Solara's pride would not let her give up. "You don't have to prove anything to me," Ilias said, his tone softer now. "We'll make it, but you have to rest when you need to." Solara paused, her face unreadable, but for the first time she seemed to consider his words. She took a deep breath and nodded, leaning on him for support as they found a small outcrop of rocks to hide behind. Ilias kept watch while Solara rested, knowing they couldn't stay long. He knew they would have to keep moving, keep pushing forward no matter how difficult it became. But for now, they had a moment of respite, and Ilias would make sure they used it wisely. Minutes passed, and Ilias's eyes remained on the horizon. The wind carried a faint sound of rustling, perhaps, or the distant crunch of boots on gravel. He tensed, instinctively drawing his weapon. The enemy was close. "Get up," Ilias said urgently, his voice low. "We need to move now." Solara didn't hesitate. She pushed herself up with Ilias's help, her body still stiff but her resolve firm. The fight wasn't over, and neither of them could afford to stop now. They moved quickly, Ilias leading the way as they took cover among the rocks and crags. The terrain was rough, and every step felt like it could be their last. But Ilias didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He would get them both out of here, no matter what it took. As they moved further into the cliffs, the sounds of the enemy grew louder. They were close now. Ilias could hear their voices in the distance, but he couldn't tell how many there were. He was used to fighting in the shadows, used to operating under the radar, but this was different. This wasn't a fight he had planned for. This was survival. And Ilias was determined to survive. Ilias and Solara moved cautiously through the rocky cliffs, their bodies tense with every step. The sound of distant voices echoed in the air, growing louder as they made their way deeper into the rugged landscape. Ilias's instincts were on high alert. He had fought many battles in his life, but this one felt different. The enemy wasn't just chasing them, they were hunting them. They had no idea how many enemy soldiers were out there, but Ilias knew they were getting closer. He could hear their footsteps, the faint crackling of rocks underfoot, and the occasional murmur of their voices carried on the wind. He paused, signaling for Solara to stop. The two of them crouched low behind a jagged outcrop, hidden from view. But not from the growing tension in the air. Ilias's eyes scanned the surroundings. The terrain was rocky and uneven, perfect for an ambush, but also dangerous for anyone trying to escape. There were no easy paths here, no quick routes to safety. If they didn't move carefully, they would be trapped. "Stay low," Ilias whispered, his voice steady but urgent. Solara nodded silently beside him, her breath shallow as she watched the enemy patrol pass by. Her body was still weak from the injury, but her warrior's instinct was sharp. She could feel the danger just as much as Elias did as the patrol. Continued its search, Elias made a decision. They had to move. The cliffs ahead offered a higher vantage point, and from there, they might be able to see their enemies before they were seen. The higher ground could provide an escape route, or at least a chance to take them by surprise. Without a word, Elias slowly and carefully led the way, with Solara right behind him. They moved as silently as possible, each step deliberate. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every sound seemed to echo. Every movement felt like it could alert the enemy. Elias kept his focus on the path ahead, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He was the one who had to protect Solara. He was the one who had to keep them both alive. They reached the higher ground just as the enemy patrol came into view. Elias crouched behind a large boulder, motioning for Solara to do the same. The view from this position was better, but it was also more dangerous. If they were seen, they wouldn't have much time to escape. The patrol was moving closer now, their voices clearer. Elias could hear them talking, but their words were indistinct. He leaned forward, trying to get a better look without being spotted. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw a group of 3 enemy soldiers moving through the cliffs. They were heading straight for the spot where Elias and Solara had been moments before. Elias held his breath, watching as the soldiers moved closer. He knew that if they didn't act soon, they would be discovered. His hand instinctively went to his weapon, but he held off from drawing it. There was no point in starting a fight unless they absolutely had to. But the longer they waited, the more dangerous the situation became. Solara's voice broke through the silence, low and steady. "What do we do now?" Elias didn't take his eyes off the enemy patrol. "We wait for the right moment," he said quietly. "If they keep moving, we can slip past them." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with the sound of their own breathing, and Elias could feel the weight of time ticking by. The enemy soldiers were getting closer. His plan had been to wait until they passed, but that was becoming less likely with each passing second. "Stay close," Elias whispered, his grip tightening on the weapon. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew they had to act. Fast. Suddenly, one of the enemy soldiers stopped and looked around. Elias's heart skipped a beat. Had they been spotted? The soldier's eyes scanned the area, lingering for a moment on the rocks where Elias and Solara were hiding. But after what felt like an eternity, the soldier turned away and continued walking with the others. Elias let out a quiet breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They hadn't been seen yet, but they were running out of time. The patrol was almost past them. It wouldn't be long before they would have to make their move. Elias nodded at Solara, signaling her to follow him. With slow, careful steps, they moved along the edge of the rocks, staying low and as hidden as possible. They crept along the cliffside, moving further away from the enemy patrol. Their escape route was ahead, but the closer they got, the more vulnerable they became. Elias could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins as they approached a small gap in the rocks, just big enough for them to slip through. But just as they were about to reach the gap, the sound of footsteps stopped them in their tracks. Elias's heart raced as he turned, expecting to see the enemy soldiers closing in on them. But this time, it wasn't the enemy. A voice called out from behind them, "You're not going anywhere." Elias's blood ran cold. The figure that stepped into view was an enemy soldier, but there was something different about him. His eyes were sharp, his stance confident. This was no ordinary soldier. Elias's grip tightened on his weapon, ready for whatever would come next. The soldier smiled coldly, his eyes narrowing. "You thought you could escape? The hunt is over." Elias felt the tension in the air shift. They had been found, and now there was no way out. But Elias wasn't about to give up. He had fought too hard, survived too much to back down now. Glanced at Solara, whose face was pale with exhaustion. But there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that matched his own. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had faced worse than this and had always come out stronger. Elias could see it in her. She wasn't just a warrior. She was someone who knew how to fight and fight to win. "I don't think you understand," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "We're not going down without a fight." Solara's hand tightened around the makeshift weapon she had fashioned from a broken piece of metal. They were outnumbered, and they were weak from the journey, but Elias knew they could do this. They had to. The soldier raised his weapon, ready to fire. But before he could make a move, Elias and Solara rushed forward together, their instincts kicking in. The battle for their lives had begun, and Elias knew that there was no turning back. The battle was intense, but Elias and Solara fought with everything they had. Their movements were synchronized, born out of necessity and survival. Elias had fought countless battles, but this one felt different. He wasn't just fighting for his own life, he was fighting for hers as well. He had made a promise to protect her, and he intended to keep it. The enemy soldier raised his weapon, but Elias was faster. He lunged forward, knocking the soldiers. Weapon aside with a swift, calculated move. Solara, despite her injury, was just as quick. She grabbed the soldier by the arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The two of them moved with precision, working as if they had been training together for years. The soldier struggled beneath Solara's grip, but his efforts were futile. He was no match for the strength of two determined warriors. Elias stood over him, his weapon ready. He could feel the weight of the moment, the realization that they had narrowly escaped death, yet again, but there was no time to savor the victory. The sound of more footsteps approaching echoed in the distance. The patrol wasn't far behind. Elias and Solara exchanged a quick glance, knowing that their time was running out. "We need to go now," Elias said, his voice urgent. Solara nodded, but she didn't move immediately. She glanced down at the soldier beneath her, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't pity. She was a warrior, and warriors didn't show pity. But there was a brief recognition of the soldier's humanity. He was just another person caught in the same war they were, another victim of a conflict that had destroyed countless lives. "Let him go," Elias said, his voice softer now. "He won't fight back." Solara hesitated for a moment longer before releasing her grip on the soldier. He quickly scrambled to his feet, looking at the two of them with a mix of fear and disbelief. There was no time for words, and Elias didn't care to exchange any with him. He turned, motioning for Solara to follow him. They moved swiftly through the cliffs, staying low and using the terrain to their advantage. Elias's heart raced as he glanced back, making sure the soldier hadn't followed them. The last thing they needed was another fight. They had no idea how many soldiers were out there, and every step they took had to be calculated. As they reached a narrow passage in the cliffs, Elias helped Solara navigate the rocks. Her strength was waning, but she didn't slow down. Her determination was palpable, and Elias admired her more with each passing moment. She was a warrior in every sense of the word, her pride, her resolve, her spirit, everything about her screamed strength. "Are you sure you're all right?" Elias asked as they paused for a moment, checking their surroundings. Solara nodded, though her face was pale with exhaustion. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed a hint of fatigue. "We can't stop now," Elias understood. There was no time to rest. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, until they reached safety. The war wasn't over, and it wasn't going to stop just because they were tired. But Elias had something else in his mind now. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger, a future they could build together. If they made it out of this alive dot as they continued their journey through the cliffs, Elias couldn't help but wonder what the future held. He had always lived in the moment, always focused on the next mission, the next battle. But now, as he looked at Solara, he realized that he had something to fight for beyond the war. There was a life waiting for them on the other side of all this, if they survived. "What will you do after the war?" Solara asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but steady. Elias didn't answer immediately. He hadn't given much thought to the future before, but now, with Solara by his side, it seemed like something worth considering. He had spent so much of his life as a soldier, fighting in wars that never seemed to end. But now, for the first time, he felt like there was more to life than the battlefield. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I've never thought about it. I've always been focused on surviving, on getting through the next fight." He paused, glancing at Solara. "But now, I don't want to just survive. I want something more." Solara gave him a small smile, a genuine expression of understanding. "I know," she said. "I feel the same way. The war has taken so much from both of us, but it doesn't have to define us forever. There's more out there." Elias nodded, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He hadn't realized how much he had been carrying, how much of his life had been consumed by the war. But with Solara, there was hope. There was a chance for something different, something better. As they reached the edge of the cliffs, the landscape opened up before them. In the distance, Elias could see signs of civilization, a small settlement, far from the chaos of the war. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a place where they could finally rest, where they could begin to rebuild their lives. A place where they could find peace. "This is it," Elias said, his voice full of quiet determination. "We'll make it there. We'll be safe." Solara looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "Together," she said softly, "we'll be together." The words hung in the air between them, a promise, a bond forged in the heat of battle and tempered by trust. Elias knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The war would leave scars, and there would be challenges to face. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready. Ready to face whatever came next. They walked side by side, their steps in sync as they moved toward the settlement. The future wasn't certain, but together they would face it. They would build something new, something worth fighting for. And for Elias, that was all that mattered.